The town of Grantham had never been brighter than on Friday, October 14th. The lights over the high school stadium burned against the cold autumn sky, drawing nearly every resident into the bleachers. It wasn't just a football game. For a town of fewer than 4,000, it was a ritual, an anchor, a reason to believe they still mattered in the wider world. At the center of it all was Jace Loring, 17 years old, quarterback, captain, and the kind of athlete who carried not only a team but the hopes of an entire community. Jace was known far beyond the field. Teachers called him polite, respectful, and driven. Younger kids idolized him, scribbling his number on notebooks and chanting his name in the cafeteria. To his parents, he was the son who still held doors open, still said thank you, still came home for dinner even when teammates stayed out late. And to the people of Grantham, he was their chance. A scholarship waiting to happen, a ticket out, maybe even a future name they could watch on college broadcasts and say, he came from here. The game that night was electric. Grantham's Wildcats faced their fiercest rival in a playoff decider. The air was sharp with the scent of concession stand popcorn and wet grass. Parents in thick jackets stomped their feet on metal bleachers to stay warm. The field glowed under the floodlights, and when Jace took the snap, the crowd roared like they were already champions. He played like the night was his, throwing 2 touchdown passes and running for another himself. Every cheer was louder than the last, every chant of his name echoing through the small town like a promise. When the final whistle blew, Grantham had won 27-24. They were moving forward, and Jace was the hero. He gave a short interview to the local radio station, his breath visible in the cold. He smiled, humble but confident, saying this was Grantham's year, that the team had never felt stronger. His words replayed over the airwaves twice before midnight, sealing the moment as one of the town's greatest triumphs. On the field, he hugged his coach, slapped helmets with teammates, and waved to his mother in the stands. For most, it was a perfect night. For Jace, it would be his last. Players began filtering off the field, some still laughing, some already pulling out their phones to check for messages. Parents loaded their cars, younger siblings tugged at blankets, and the stands emptied into the night. Jace walked toward the tunnel, cleats still on, helmet dangling from his hand. He looked tired, but not troubled. One assistant coach would later say he seemed quiet, reflective even, as though he was still playing out the final quarter in his mind. He stepped through the metal doors into the east hallway that led to the locker rooms, the sound of cheering dulled behind him. That was the last moment anyone could confirm. Inside, the locker room was chaotic. Music blared from a Bluetooth speaker. Jerseys were tossed in piles on the floor. Steam from the showers filled the air. Some boys joked and shoved each other. Others rushed to meet rides. No one noticed Jace slip in. By the time most of the team had changed and left, he wasn't there. It was Coach Hemsley who first realized something was off. Around 11:15 p.m., he was doing his usual rounds, checking the showers, the equipment closets, making sure nothing was left behind. He looked for Jace, expecting him to still be talking with teammates. When he didn't find him, he assumed maybe Jace had already left. But then he saw his car, still parked by the vending machines, locked, his backpack sitting untouched on the passenger seat. Hemsley tried calling him. No answer. He texted, "Where'd you go? You okay?" The screen stayed dark. Minutes stretched. At first, there was no panic. Teenagers left without telling anyone all the time. But Jace wasn't like most teenagers. He wasn't careless. He had practice schedules, homework routines, and curfews. By midnight, the unease had set in. Hemsley called Jace's mother, Valerie. She answered, confused at first, certain her son was with friends or maybe celebrating. But when she checked, when she called his phone and got nothing, she drove to the school in her slippers and hoodie, her heart already pounding. Together, she and Hemsley searched the building. They opened classroom doors, checked janitor closets, retraced every step from the field to the locker room. They called his name, their voices echoing against the walls. Nothing, no phone, no wallet, no jacket. It was as if he had evaporated in the span of minutes. By 12:41 a.m., he was officially reported missing. The sheriff's deputies arrived and began interviewing anyone who had lingered after the game. Students remembered seeing him near the tunnel. A concession worker thought he'd come by for water. A cheerleader swore she saw him enter the hallway. But there was no consistent timeline, no clear sighting after 10:43 p.m. The stadium was swept, the field searched, the parking lot lit up by patrol cars. Dogs were brought in and tracked his scent from the locker room toward the lot, but it vanished near the edge of the gym. The trail ended as if he'd walked into thin air. By morning, Grantham woke to the news that their brightest star was gone. Flyers went up, the school shut down. Volunteers fanned out across woods and back roads. Helicopters hovered, drones scanned rivers, boats dragged the nearby creek. But as the hours passed, nothing appeared. No footprints, no clothing, no discarded items. Just silence. Valerie stood in the parking lot, gripping the door handle of her son's locked car, staring through the glass at his backpack, at the life he had intended to pick up again that night. Around her, officers moved with flashlights and radios, but she barely noticed. She had always told herself her son was safe here, that Grantham's walls and traditions would hold him. Now she realized those walls had taken him. By Sunday, rumors swelled. Some said he had run away. Others whispered of abduction, of rivalries, of grudges left unspoken. None of it felt real. Jace had been there one moment, smiling, waving, promising a season of victories, and then he was gone. The game that had defined him had also marked his disappearance. The town tried to move forward, but behind the painted walls of the school, behind the repainted hallways and silent locker rooms, something had already been buried, and it would be 10 long years before those walls revealed what they were hiding. The night Jace disappeared, deputies treated it as a runaway scenario. It was protocol. 17-year-olds leave, they argued. They get in cars with friends, cool off after games, sometimes vanish for a night or two before showing up again. But by sunrise, the weight of what had happened began to crush even the skeptics. Jace Loring wasn't just any teenager. He was steady, predictable, grounded in a town that knew every detail of his life. He didn't skip practice. He didn't break the curfew. He didn't vanish without a word. By dawn, the search began in earnest. Grantham High was locked down as deputies and volunteers swept through every hallway and storage closet. Flashlights cut across empty classrooms, cafeteria tables, and boiler rooms. They returned again and again to the east corridor, the tunnel that led to the locker rooms. But nothing turned up. No scuff marks, no clothing, no trace that Jace had ever walked out. From the school, the search fanned outward. Bloodhounds were brought in by mid-morning, leashed and eager, their handlers guiding them around the parking lot. The dogs caught a strong scent near the locker room entrance. They pulled hard, dragging deputies across the asphalt and toward Jace's car. The trail circled once, then moved to the edge of the lot, and then, inexplicably, it ended. The dogs sniffed, turned, circled again, but could not push beyond a 15-foot radius, as if the boy had simply vanished into the air. Deputies pushed farther out. Creeks were combed by volunteers in hip waders. Drones were flown over the forest that bordered the school's property. Officers on ATVs cut paths through brush, while others knocked on nearby doors. By midday, the sheriff's office issued a formal missing persons alert. For a town this small, it was unthinkable. Their brightest star was gone. Word spread quickly. By early afternoon, hundreds of townspeople joined the search. Hunters who knew every ridge of the woods offered their knowledge of back trails. Farmers opened barns and sheds. Cars lined the school drive as people arrived with bottled water and flashlights, forming search lines that stretched across fields. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights dragging across the landscape like eyes that never blinked. But despite the effort, every sweep came up empty. Detectives began considering darker possibilities. If Jace had left willingly, where would he go? His car and backpack were still in the lot. His wallet was gone, but his phone had stopped pinging at 10:46 p.m., just minutes after he was last seen. There was no indication of a fight, no broken glass, no tire marks. If he had been abducted, the abductor left no trace. And if he had hidden somewhere in the school, the building had been searched top to bottom. Nothing. The first interview cycle began with teammates. Coaches and deputies sat players down one by one, asking about the night. They all said the same thing. They saw Jace after the game, smiling, tired, walking toward the locker room. A few admitted they hadn't spoken to him directly, but assumed he was there among the chaos. None reported any argument or confrontation. None admitted seeing him leave. The repetition felt rehearsed. Detectives noted inconsistencies in timing, in who left when, but nothing substantial enough to break. By Sunday, whispers began. In a town that fed on speculation, theories spread faster than fact. Some said he'd been targeted by someone jealous of his success. Others said a stranger had been seen near the parking lot that night, though no one could provide a description. Still others whispered he'd run off with a girl, a theory that stung his mother like an insult. Valerie dismissed it outright. Her son would never abandon his family, not without a word, not on the night of the most important game of his life. The sheriff called in dive teams to search the nearby reservoir. Boats skimmed across the water, dragging sonar beneath the surface. Divers plunged into the cold, murky depths, emerging hours later with nothing but weeds and silt. The lake gave no answers. By Monday, the FBI was contacted. A 17-year-old star athlete vanishing in such circumstances caught federal attention, but only briefly. Agents reviewed security footage, interviewed administrators, and surveyed the scene. They noted one troubling detail. The east hallway camera, aimed directly at the locker rooms, had a gap in its recording. 14 minutes missing, coinciding with the exact time Jace disappeared. The school blamed outdated equipment. The FBI flagged it as suspicious, but without more evidence of interstate involvement or kidnapping, they withdrew. The case fell back into the hands of the local sheriff's office, underfunded and under pressure. The days dragged on. Posters with Jace's photo went up in every store window, stapled to telephone poles, mailed to surrounding counties. His smile, frozen in a team photo, became the haunting symbol of absence. Volunteers began to dwindle. Searches spread thinner, covering more ground with fewer eyes. Each night, Valerie sat by her phone, waiting for a call that never came. Each morning, she drove back to the school, standing in the lot staring at the space where his car had been towed away for evidence. The tension fractured the town. Neighbors began accusing one another, suspicion dripping into conversations once filled with warmth. Old grudges resurfaced. Parents who trusted the school to keep their children safe now demanded answers. At board meetings, administrators promised they were cooperating fully, but their silence grew heavier. They said little about Donald, the assistant coach already on leave, and nothing about the camera glitch. As weeks turned into months, the search effort shifted from rescue to recovery. Tips trickled in from surrounding states, sightings of boys who looked like Jace in gas stations, rest stops, shopping malls. Each one was investigated. Each one came up false. The case slipped from headlines. The town tried to move forward, but it was impossible to return to normal. The bleachers that once erupted with cheers now carried a quiet dread. The Wildcats played on, but no victory could mask the hollow seat where Jace's mother once sat. And still, no trace. No footprints, no clothing, no body. He had walked into the locker room and never walked out again. That winter, the sheriff admitted privately to Valerie that they were out of leads. Without new evidence, the case would remain open but inactive. It was not closure, not even progress. It was a sentence of limbo. For Valerie, that meant her son was neither alive nor dead, only missing. A word that offered no comfort, no explanation, only torment. Behind the walls of Grantham High, life went on. New seasons began. Students graduated. But the silence lingered. The locker room was scrubbed clean, the hallway repainted, the camera glitch dismissed. The town tried to bury its fear under routine. But the truth remained. Jace had vanished in a place meant to protect him, surrounded by people who should have seen. And the trail had ended, before it even began. Years later, people would look back on that first weekend and realize something had been missed, something buried in plain sight. But in those early days, the only thing anyone knew for certain was that a boy had been swallowed whole by his own school, and Grantham was left searching for answers it would not find for a decade. The first thing they did was pull the footage. There were 3 cameras in total covering the rear of the stadium, one facing the players' tunnel, one overlooking the parking lot from the gym's rooftop, and one inside the east hallway leading to the locker rooms. None of them were high-end. The school had upgraded the field lights 3 years prior, but never touched the security system. Grainy, low frame rate, time-stamped but unreliable. Still, investigators hoped it might give them something, anything. The footage from the rooftop camera showed the team dispersing, players walking toward their cars in groups, a few lingering near the benches. At 10:43 p.m., Jace appeared at the edge of the frame, walking alone toward the side entrance. His gait was normal. Nothing looked off. He wasn't being chased. He wasn't on his phone. He just disappeared past the metal doors like he always did. But then, at 10:44 p.m., another figure appeared, barely visible, distant, dark clothing, indistinct outline, possibly a hood or a cap. The person walked several paces behind Jace, entering the same door. The movement was too fluid for a glitch, too deliberate to dismiss. But the camera didn't catch their faces. Investigators froze the frame, enhanced it, and ran it through low-end AI models. No match. The silhouette had no clear features, no visible backpack or gear, no identifying markers at all. Just a presence. Then, the hallway camera inside should have picked up what happened next. But that's when the system failed. The east hallway feed, the one aimed directly at the locker room, cut out at 10:45 p.m. The screen went black, no warning, no static. The system simply logged a 15-minute recording gap from 10:45 to 10:59 p.m. When it came back, the hallway was empty, silent, doors shut, no Jace, no shadow, no movement. Whatever happened during those 14 minutes left no visible trace. The IT technician for the school claimed it was a known issue. The hard drives were old, the system prone to hiccups. A scheduled backup may have conflicted with real-time recording. He showed logs of previous months where similar gaps had occurred, though none had ever coincided with something this serious. The state police weren't convinced. They seized the DVR units. Forensic video specialists were brought in. They checked for tampering. No conclusive evidence either way. Just a gap. Like time itself had gone missing. Within 48 hours, the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit got involved, given the nature of the disappearance and potential interstate implications. They brought in their own tech experts, ran server-level diagnostics, even looked at surrounding traffic cams for clues. But there were no leads, no ransom notes, no digital footprints, no cell tower activity. Nothing moved. It was like Jace had walked into a black hole. Then, just as quickly as the FBI came, they pulled out. The official explanation? Lack of federal interest. There were no indicators of kidnapping for exploitation, no links to any ongoing investigations, no proof the case extended beyond local jurisdiction. Without a clear federal crime, the agents turned it back over to the county. The family was told it wasn't a rejection, just a procedural reality. But for Valerie Loring, it felt like another door slamming shut. Over the weekend, the school made quiet moves. A custodial crew came in early Sunday morning and repainted the east hallway walls. No official memo was issued. Just a note in the maintenance log about routine upkeep. The hallway where Jace had last been seen, the same hallway that glitched out, was scrubbed clean. New paint, new signage, and by Monday morning, the building was back open to students. When asked, the principal said the repainting had been scheduled well in advance. A coincidence, but no one in town believed that. By the third year, the flyers had stopped going up. By the fifth, most people had stopped asking. Jace Loring's photo still hung in the high school hallway, but it had yellowed at the edges, its corners curling from humidity and time. His name came up less and less, even during football season. New players filled the roster, coaches changed, a new scoreboard was installed. The stadium was still called Loring Field, unofficially, but few said it out loud anymore. Grantham had learned to live with the silence, or at least pretend to. Then, in year 6, something cracked. It began with a blog post, anonymous, buried deep in a local journalist's website. A former Wildcat football player who'd since left town claimed there was more to that night than anyone had admitted. He didn't give his name, only initials, but he made one thing clear. We all knew something was wrong that night. We just didn't know how wrong it would get. The post mentioned disciplinary issues, something unspoken among teammates, and hinted at locker room rituals that had been escalating that season. Within days, the town tried to shut it down. The article was flagged for defamation. The journalist, A freelance crime reporter named Ellis Hart said she received 2 cease and desist emails from local school board attorneys. The post was taken offline, but by then, screenshots had already circulated. Reddit threads exploded. Amateur investigators pulled yearbooks, archived rosters, and message boards. Patterns emerged. Jace had been benched for 2 games mid-season, something almost no one outside the team had questioned at the time. The reason listed in a forgotten sports blog was internal discipline, but no specifics were ever made public. One parent commented anonymously that her son came home from practice that October with a black eye and refused to talk about it. Another claimed her nephew had quit the team after a strange night in the locker room involving the seniors and a bucket of ice. Online sleuths began piecing together a theory. There were whispers of hazing, but more than that, of something structured, ritualistic. Seniors targeting underclassmen, forced silence, physical punishments. No one confirmed anything outright, but phrases repeated across accounts. Initiation night, the tunnel, dead laps. Rumors that a tradition had developed behind the locker room doors, one that no coach officially acknowledged and no player dared speak of until they were safely out of Grantham. Ellis Hart tried to contact former players directly. Most didn't respond. One agreed to talk, then ghosted before the interview. Another sent a message at 2:13 a.m. It wasn't supposed to go that far. We didn't mean for him to. The message ended there. No one confessed. No names were released. No one admitted to witnessing anything. But under the surface, something had changed. Grantham wasn't quiet anymore. It was defensive. Tense. And people were starting to realize maybe the town hadn't just lost a boy. Maybe it had buried the truth right alongside him. By the 10th year, the case had become more of a shadow than a story. The school still held candlelight vigils for Jace, but attendance dwindled. New students walked the same halls, showered in the same locker rooms, and some barely even knew his name. His parents had stopped attending the football games altogether. For them, every whistle and cheer was another reminder of what was stolen. Then came October 14th, 2020, the exact anniversary of the night Jace vanished. It should have been just another uneasy milestone in a town that had long learned how to avoid saying his name. But that morning, a custodian named Henry Dalton noticed something odd while scrubbing down the boys' locker room showers. Behind one of the old tiled walls, a corner had come loose. When Dalton pressed it, the tile shifted. Dirt and mold had collected at the edges, as though the wall hadn't been touched in years. Pulling it aside, he saw something scratched faintly into the plaster behind it. Letters, shaky, faded, but unmistakable. They spelled a single word, Jace. The custodian froze. It didn't look new. The scratches had grit in their grooves, like they had been there for a long time. A decade, maybe. His hands shook as he took out his phone and snapped a picture. Within hours, that photo was online. By afternoon, it had gone viral. Local students shared it across social media, captioning it with claims that Jace had tried to leave a message before he disappeared. Some thought it was a cruel prank. Others swore it was proof he had been trapped somewhere inside those walls. Hashtags began trending, pulling the case back into public view. The police could no longer ignore it. For the first time in years, the Grantham Police Department reopened the investigation. Detectives returned to the school, photographing the wall and running tests on the plaster. They confirmed the scratches were old, though they couldn't precisely date them. To Valerie Loring, that didn't matter. For her, it was her son's hand. Her boy called out, desperate, alone. Reporters swarmed the town again, asking why this detail had never been uncovered. The school board claimed no one had ever done a full tile replacement in that section. It had simply been overlooked. But locals weren't convinced. Too many things had been overlooked. The renewed investigation turned inward, back to the players from that night. Detectives re-interviewed the original team members, most of them now in their late 20s. Some had moved out of state, some refused to return calls. A few agreed to sit down but gave the same practiced lines they had rehearsed a decade earlier. They didn't see anything unusual. They left early. Jace seemed fine. Yet, under the surface, the pressure was different now. The scratched name changed everything. It was no longer just a disappearance. It hinted at captivity, at suffering, at the possibility that Jace had been left behind, alive, begging to be found. One former teammate broke down during questioning. His words didn't come out clearly. He kept saying it was supposed to be a joke, that no one thought it would go this far. Detectives pressed him, but he shut down. His lawyer cut the interview short. The official statement never made it to the public. Still, rumors leaked. For the first time, the silence cracked, and the town began to wonder if the truth had been sitting in that locker room the entire time, sealed behind walls no one dared break open. The decision to open the walls did not come quickly. At first, police treated the scratched name as circumstantial, a curious but unprovable piece of evidence. But public pressure mounted after the photo went viral. Parents demanded answers. Online sleuths posted diagrams of the gym's layout, insisting something was hidden behind those tiled walls. And Valerie Loring, who had spent 10 years begging for the truth, refused to back down. Finally, the school board authorized a full forensic search of the east locker room and shower corridor, the same hallway where the cameras had gone dark the night Jace disappeared. Crews moved in early one morning with portable lights and demolition tools. The walls were scanned with ground-penetrating radar, equipment usually reserved for crime scenes and construction collapses. What the technicians found sent a chill through the room. Behind the plaster and tile, the radar showed an irregular void, a hollow space not accounted for in the original building plans. It was small, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, sealed on all sides, and tucked between layers of insulation and concrete. In the blueprints, that area should have been a solid wall. The crew began tearing it down. The sound of chisels and hammers echoed across the gym floor, watched by officers, detectives, and a handful of silent administrators. When the final slab broke away, the opening revealed a narrow crawl space, claustrophobic, hidden, stale with the scent of rot and dust. Flashlights swept inside. What they illuminated silenced the entire room. On the cracked concrete floor lay remnants of shredded gym clothes, torn beyond recognition, but in colors that matched the Wildcats' uniforms from a decade earlier. A broken phone case sat near the edge, warped and brittle. The most damning discovery was darker. A patch of old blood staining the concrete, faded to brown but still visible. Samples were taken immediately, swabbed and sealed. The scene was cordoned off with crime tape. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was now a suspected homicide. Within 72 hours, DNA testing confirmed what everyone feared. The blood was Jace Loring's. Forensic analysts determined the material had been there for years. It had not been staged or planted. The crawl space was authentic, untouched, forgotten until the wall came down. The conclusion was clear. Jace had not simply vanished from Grantham High. He had been trapped, injured, and hidden behind its very walls. The revelation ignited fury across the town. Parents packed school board meetings, demanding resignations. Reporters from national outlets swarmed Grantham, broadcasting live outside the football stadium where banners of Jace's smiling face now hung in mourning. Questions multiplied. Who built the crawl space? Who sealed it? Why were there no records of its existence? Had staff or coaches known about it all along? And, most haunting of all, had Jace been alive in those first desperate hours while his mother searched the halls? The outrage was compounded by guilt. Teachers who had worked at the school 10 years ago spoke in whispers about rumors they had dismissed. Former teammates, now adults, admitted they'd always felt something was hidden that night, though none confessed to knowing the full truth. The silence that had once protected Grantham's traditions now looked like complicity. The county sheriff's office held a press conference, formally declaring Jace's disappearance a homicide investigation. Detectives pledged transparency, but their words did little to calm the crowd gathered outside. Shouts of cover-up rang out. Protesters carried signs that read, "Justice for Jace," and "What are you hiding?" Grantham, once unified under Friday night lights, was now fractured. Parents pulled their children from the team. Alumni distanced themselves. The Wildcats' legacy had curdled into something sinister. For Valerie and her family, the discovery was both vindication and devastation. She had always believed her son never left the school that night. Now she knew she had been right. But the confirmation that his blood had soaked into its concrete floor, sealed away in darkness, left her with more questions than answers. How long had he suffered? Who had walked past that wall, knowing or pretending not to know what was behind it? The locker room was closed indefinitely. Armed guards stood outside. Investigators cataloged every inch of the crawl space, pulling fibers, scraping dust, lifting prints where they could. The work was meticulous, but one fact was already undeniable. Jace Loring had died inside Grantham High School. The mystery was no longer where he had gone, but who had put him there, and why it had taken a decade for the truth to finally bleed out of the walls. The discovery inside the wall turned the investigation in a new direction, and it didn't take long for attention to settle on one name that had quietly lingered on the margins of the original case: assistant coach Ray Donnell. At the time of Jace's disappearance, Donnell had been the second in command on the Wildcats staff, responsible for conditioning, discipline, and what he often called toughness drills. To many of the boys, he was less a coach and more a tormentor. Former players recalled late-night practices that stretched until players collapsed, verbal tirades in the locker room, and punishments that crossed well beyond the line of tradition. Still, he had been tolerated, even defended, because the Wildcats had been winning. But what no one realized until much later was that Donnell had quietly been dismissed from Grantham High just 3 months after Jace vanished. There had been no public announcement, no explanation to parents, only a brief mention in the school board's meeting minutes. Assistant Coach Donnell's contract terminated, personnel matter. Investigators now dug into his past. What they uncovered was chilling. Before coming to Grantham, Donnell had worked at a high school 2 counties away. Records from that school showed sealed disciplinary hearings, but they had never been publicized. Through court filings and leaked documents, journalists discovered that in his final year there, a 17-year-old basketball player had gone missing under strange circumstances. That case had been written off as a runaway, with little investigation. But whispers circulated that Donnell had been the last adult to see the boy. Parents complained of excessive punishments in the gym basement, but nothing had ever been proven. The missing teen's case was left unsolved. Back in Grantham, Donnell was known for holding what he called sessions in the back rooms of the gym. Players described being forced to run barefoot on the concrete until their feet blistered. Others remembered being locked in equipment closets, sometimes with the lights cut off, as a form of punishment for mistakes on the field. Some insisted it was all part of the culture, meant to harden them. Others admitted it had crossed into humiliation and cruelty. The line between hazing and abuse had blurred. The discovery of Jace's blood behind the shower wall now made those memories far darker. When confronted by reporters in his small rental house on the edge of town, Donnell refused to answer questions. Neighbors described him as reclusive, rarely leaving except for groceries. He seemed paranoid, curtains always drawn, often seen sitting on his porch smoking late at night, staring into nothing. When asked directly if he knew anything about Jace's death, his only response was, "No comment," before shutting the door. The silence felt like confirmation. Investigators attempted to bring him in for formal questioning. His lawyer stalled, citing health issues. Meanwhile, pressure from the community mounted. Old teammates of Jace began speaking out in hushed tones. One admitted he had seen Donnell lead Jace down the east hallway the night of the game. Another said he remembered hearing shouting coming from behind the shower corridor. None of them had spoken up before. Fear, loyalty, and intimidation had kept them quiet. Now, with the crawl space exposed, their memories carried a heavier weight. Days after refusing to comment, Donnell was found unresponsive in his home. He had attempted suicide by overdose. Paramedics arrived in time to save him, and he was hospitalized under psychiatric observation. For many in Grantham, that was as close to an admission of guilt as they were ever going to get. But the case against him was not yet complete. Detectives needed a confession, or at least evidence that tied him directly to the crawl space. As Donnell lay in a hospital bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, the question hung heavy over the investigation. Had the man responsible for Jace's disappearance finally been cornered, or was the truth still buried deeper? Hidden in secrets the town had been too afraid to face for over a decade. Ray Donnell's condition stabilized in the hospital, though his body carried the toll of years of stress and a recent attempt to end his life. He was kept under suicide watch, confined to a bed with guards stationed outside the door. To the public, his silence had already spoken volumes, but investigators still needed answers, direct confirmation of what happened the night Jace Loring disappeared. For a week, Donald said nothing, refusing to respond to detectives, journalists, or even former colleagues who tried to reach him. Then, without warning, he asked to see a priest. Father Matthew Cole, a local parish priest, arrived late in the evening. He found Donald sitting upright, pale but lucid. What unfolded during that conversation would later leak through multiple channels, reshaping the entire case. Donald told Father Cole that he had not killed Jace. Not in the way people thought. He said Jace had broken a rule, disrespected the authority of the team, and he wanted to make an example out of him. He admitted to taking Jace into the east corridor, the one that led to the shower rooms. He claimed he locked him in the hidden crawl space, a space he had used before for what he called discipline sessions. Donald told the priest it was only meant to last a night. The plan, he said, was to scare him. Leave him there until morning, then let him out, shaken but unharmed. But things had gone wrong. No one else found him, and Donald claimed he never went back. When detectives questioned Father Cole afterward, he confirmed the broad strokes, but reminded them the details had come during a private pastoral conversation. Still, word of the confession spread. Investigators obtained a warrant to question Donald formally. When detectives sat across from him in his hospital bed, he seemed hollowed out, exhausted, almost eager for it to end. He repeated parts of the story, often contradicting himself, but one line he returned to again and again. "I didn't kill him. I just walked away." He claimed Jace was alive when he left him, that the crawl space was not supposed to be his tomb. Donald said he assumed another coach, or even a custodian, would eventually find him. He insisted he never imagined Jace would be left there for good. The statement was devastating for the Loring family. To them, it meant Jace had suffered needlessly, abandoned in the dark, while his mother searched the halls just outside. Valerie imagined her son crying out, clawing at the walls, while adults who could have saved him walked past without knowing. For investigators, Donald's words were damning, but incomplete. They needed to know whether Jace's death had truly been an accident of neglect, or if Donald's hands were directly responsible. That answer came from forensics. The crawl space itself had become a crime scene laboratory. Every fragment of debris was tested. On the broken phone case recovered inside, analysts found partial fingerprints. They matched Donald. Traces of skin cells on the tile edges also tied back to him. But the most incriminating discovery came from the blood patterns on the floor. Forensic experts determined the stains were not consistent with someone simply waiting or scratching their name. They showed impact, drops scattered from a height. A smear along the base suggested Jace had been struck, possibly more than once, and had crawled before collapsing. One fracture in the concrete matched the corner of a metal weight bar, a piece of equipment later confirmed to have been stored in the same corridor during Donald's tenure. These details undermined his story. Donald's claim that he had left Jace unhurt no longer aligned with the evidence. Confronted with this, he grew defensive, sweating, shaking his head, and repeating the same phrase until his voice cracked. "I didn't kill him. I didn't kill him. I just walked away." But the picture forming around him told a harsher truth, that Jace had not simply been abandoned. He had been injured badly enough that survival without help was impossible. The forensic team concluded his cause of death was a combination of blunt force trauma and dehydration. He had suffered for hours, maybe days, before the crawl space became silent. What haunted investigators most was the timeline. Records showed that Jace's mother had searched the school within an hour of his disappearance. Deputies had walked the hallways before sunrise. Coaches had stood near the very wall where his body would later be found. If Donald had confessed earlier, even a few hours later, Jace might have been saved. Instead, silence and fear allowed him to die inches away from help. The town reacted with fury. News of Donald's partial confession leaked to the public, sparking vigils, protests, and a storm of national media coverage. Parents demanded accountability from the school board, accusing them of protecting Donnell despite years of complaints. Former players described patterns of abuse they had long kept quiet about, stories of being locked in dark rooms or humiliated in front of teammates. One player admitted he had once been shoved into the same crawl space, though only for a few minutes, and only as a so-called lesson. Until Jace, no one had been left there overnight. Despite his repeated denials of direct intent, prosecutors began preparing a homicide case. Negligent or not, Donald's actions had led directly to Jace's death. But in the hospital room, as he sat staring at the floor with trembling hands, it seemed clear to detectives that the assistant coach was no longer fighting for freedom. He was simply fighting to preserve a version of the truth he could live with, that he hadn't meant to kill a boy, only to scare him. Yet every piece of evidence, every drop of blood, every mark carved into that wall pointed to the same conclusion. Donald might not have swung the final blow with the intent to end a life, but when he locked that crawlspace door and walked away, he had delivered the sentence all the same. The confession that had begun as an attempt to explain away his guilt now became the very foundation of the case against him. And as prosecutors built their timeline, one chilling realization lingered for Jace's family and for the community. What Donald left out of his story might matter more than what he admitted, and there were still secrets hidden inside those walls that only the dead could tell. The demolition of the East Corridor revealed not only the crawl space, but an engineering nightmare that explained why Jace's cries had never carried beyond the walls. Forensic engineers and crime scene experts rebuilt the locker room section layer by layer, cataloging what they found. Behind the tiled surface was drywall, then thick insulation packed tight with aged dust, and behind that, another layer of soundproofing material, likely added during a remodel to keep locker room noise from disrupting classrooms. The result was a near airtight chamber. What looked from the outside like ordinary construction was, in reality, a sealed vault. If Jace had screamed, no one outside those walls would have heard him. Medical examiners pieced together what had likely happened after Donald locked him inside. Jace had not gone in willingly. The broken phone case, the scattered blood drops, and the fractured concrete suggested he had been injured before or during confinement. Blunt force trauma left him disoriented, maybe unconscious at first. When he came to, he would have found himself trapped in pitch dark, a narrow cell no larger than a coffin turned sideways. In those conditions, panic set in quickly. He tried to claw out. The plaster bore faint scratch marks. His knuckles had bite impressions, evidence of gnawing on his own hands in desperation. The coroner concluded he survived for up to 3 days. Dehydration ravaged him, his injuries worsened by the lack of medical attention. Internal bleeding compounded the agony. Alone, unseen, he faded until silence returned to the crawl space. The official ruling classified the death as accidental homicide, a term that cut deep for his family. It meant the state recognized that Jace had been unlawfully confined, that negligence and assault had led to his death, but it fell short of first-degree murder. For prosecutors, intent was nearly impossible to prove beyond doubt. Donald's partial confession, that he had meant only to scare him, not to kill him, became both shield and weapon. Yet for Jace's parents, the label of accident felt obscene. Their son hadn't simply stumbled into a tragic mishap. He had been placed inside, hurt, and abandoned by an adult entrusted with his care. To them, it was murder in everything but name. When charges were announced, Donald was indicted on counts of manslaughter, unlawful confinement, and child endangerment resulting in death. The courtroom would decide whether his actions crossed into murder. But outside the legal language, in the town of Grantham, the conclusion was already clear. The assistant coach's cruelty had created the conditions for Jace's death, and his silence afterward had condemned him to it. The public response was visceral. Candlelight vigils were no longer quiet affairs of remembrance, but rallies demanding justice. Former players admitted the so-called discipline sessions had always been brutal, that they had feared Donald more than they had respected him. Some confessed they had once joked that the wall swallowed mistakes. That phrase now sounded like an omen. Grantham's small-town pride, once built on Friday night lights and wildcat victories, was replaced by shame. Parents who had once cheered in the bleachers now carried signs outside the courthouse demanding maximum sentencing. For investigators, the most haunting detail wasn't the legal framework, but the timeline reconstructed from forensic evidence. If Jace had lived for 3 days, then for 72 hours the town had searched fields, rivers, and highways while he remained locked inside the very building swarming with deputies. His mother had walked the same hallway where he bled and begged for help. Officers had stood feet away, certain he had left the campus when the truth was entombed behind drywall. That knowledge became unbearable for many of those who had worked the case. Veterans of law enforcement admitted privately that it was the worst failure of their careers. Even with charges brought, the case did not feel resolved. Donald's insistence that he had not meant to kill left a hollow space between legal truth and moral reality. To the law, intent determined the degree of guilt. To the community, the outcome mattered more than motive. A boy had been left to die behind a locker room wall, and the man responsible had walked free for a decade. The trial loomed, but even conviction could not erase what the reconstruction had shown. In the courtroom, diagrams of the wall were displayed, photographs of the crawlspace shown to the jury. Prosecutors described the agony of those 3 days in detail, the soundproofing that turned his cries into silence, the blood patterns that proved injury before confinement. They spoke of the bite marks on his knuckles, an image that caused several jurors to avert their eyes. The defense repeated the phrase Donald had clung to. "I didn't kill him, I just walked away." But as each layer of the wall was explained, each forensic result revealed, it became clear that walking away had been the act that ended Jace's life. The ruling of accidental homicide might have stood in official documents, but the reconstruction of the wall transformed the narrative forever. It wasn't an accident. It was neglect elevated to cruelty, silence stretched into death. And for Jace's family, the knowledge that he had lived long enough to try to write his name, to scratch letters into the plaster that no one would see for 10 years, was the heaviest truth of all. As Donald awaited trial, the community braced itself. The facts were known, the evidence laid out, yet what punishment could equal the crime? No sentence could rewind the 72 hours when Jace could have been saved, and no verdict could strip away the image now burned into everyone's mind, that a boy had died crying in silence, his last days sealed behind the very walls that were meant to protect him. The aftermath of the trial left Grantham reeling. The courtroom had been filled with parents, alumni, and reporters, all hearing the same conclusion. Jace's death was the result of unlawful confinement, negligence, and abuse of authority. Donald's conviction gave a sense of closure on paper, but in the streets and living rooms of the town, the wound was still open. Within weeks, every member of the Grantham School Board resigned under pressure. They had ignored complaints for years, dismissed rumors of hazing, and quietly dismissed Donald when the scrutiny became uncomfortable. Now their silence looked like complicity. Their departure did nothing to soothe the grief, but it was the first tangible act of accountability the community had seen. Almost immediately, memorials appeared. Students who had never even met Jace brought flowers to the stadium gates. Candles flickered along the fence line. Old jerseys with his number scrawled in marker were hung on the chain link, fluttering in the wind. A mural was painted on the side of the local diner, his face surrounded by messages like "Never Forget" and "Justice for Jace." At night, families gathered quietly, some in prayer, others in tears. What had been a story whispered in shadows was now an open wound the whole town could see. Former teammates, many of them grown men with families of their own, began releasing statements. Some admitted guilt for not speaking up, for brushing off suspicions, for letting fear keep them silent. Others admitted they had known more than they ever told police. A few confessed to witnessing Donald's cruelty firsthand, but rationalizing it as just part of the program. One player, his voice trembling during a radio interview, said he would carry the weight forever. The silence of those years, he said, had been as lethal as Donald's actions. Jace's parents pursued civil action against the district, arguing the school had failed in its duty to protect their son. The lawsuit revealed even more damning evidence. Prior complaints against Donald had been logged but never escalated. Staff had raised concerns about his discipline sessions, but the administration downplayed them, citing tradition and athletic success. After months of legal battle, the Lorings were awarded a record civil settlement. The money could never replace what they had lost, but it forced the district to admit its failures publicly. For Valerie and her husband, it was a symbolic victory in a war they never asked to fight. The locker room itself became the final target of public outrage. Parents petitioned to have it torn down, arguing that no new season should begin in a building that had doubled as a tomb. Demolition crews arrived under police watch as crowds gathered behind barricades. Piece by piece, the walls came down, every swing of the sledgehammer revealing the skeleton of the place where Jace's final hours had passed. Dust filled the air, the echo of collapsing concrete mixing with the sound of people weeping in silence. When the wreckage was finally cleared, the town announced a memorial garden would take its place, but the demolition revealed one final secret. Inside a rusted HVAC vent near the showers, sealed behind layers of dust and metal, workers found a phone. It was water-stained, its case cracked, but remarkably intact. Serial numbers confirmed it was Jace's missing phone, the one that had been searched for endlessly but never found. Forensic technicians carefully recovered it and managed to power it long enough to extract its contents. What they found shook even the most hardened investigators. Among the fragments of data, there was a voice memo. The timestamp placed it within hours of Jace's disappearance, during the window when search teams believed he had still been alive. The recording was short, barely over a minute. In it, Jace's voice trembled as he cried, begging for help, calling out for his mother, his words breaking into sobs. His breathing was labored, his voice hoarse, but every word carried the unmistakable panic of someone who knew he was trapped. He said he couldn't get out. He said it hurt. The audio ended suddenly with a sharp bang against metal. Then silence. When that recording was played for his parents in private, Valerie collapsed. To her, it was proof not only of his suffering, but of his will to survive, his desperate attempt to leave something behind. The memo was never released in full to the public, but word of its existence spread quickly. It became the most haunting piece of evidence in the case, not because it proved Donald's guilt, but because it gave voice to Jace's final moments. No rumor, no theory, no courtroom testimony could erase the sound of a boy begging for help that never came. Grantham tried to move forward, but its identity was forever changed. The Wildcats returned to the field the following season, but the stadium was quieter. The cheers rang hollow. The memorial garden outside the demolished locker room became the town's true center, where families came to lay flowers and touch the stone etched with Jace's name. Every year on October 14th, the crowd gathered there instead of in the bleachers, candles glowing against the dark, the sound of silence louder than any game. The story of Jace Loring was no longer just about a missing athlete. It became a cautionary tale about silence, about blind loyalty to tradition, and about the devastating consequences of looking away. The town had tried to forget him once. Now, with the truth carved into its walls and preserved in the haunting echoes of a final recording, forgetting him was no longer possible.